3 weeks before Nina Simone died, she recorded one final song in her bedroom. It was never meant to be heard by anyone, just a dying woman's last attempt to make peace with her past. The words she sang reveal the true cost of a lifetime spent fighting battles that could never really be won. This is the story of Nina Simone's final, most heartbreaking performance. On March 30th, 2003, in a modest bedroom overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, Nina Simone sat at a small electric keyboard she had bought at a local music store. Her hands, once capable of commanding grand pianos with thunderous power, now shook from the chemotherapy coursing through her veins. Her voice, which had once filled concert halls and rallied civil rights marchers, was barely a whisper, but she had something to say. Something that couldn't wait any longer. Her housekeeper, Marie, found the cassette tape 3 days after Nina's death on April 21st. It was labeled simply "Pour me's regrets for my regrets" in Nina's shaky handwriting. The recording lasted only 12 minutes, but it contained a lifetime of pain, guilt, and desperate hope for redemption. The song had no title, no structure, no melody that anyone would recognize. It was pure stream of consciousness, a dying woman's final attempt to confess the sins that had haunted her for decades. The tape begins with Nina's labored breathing, then the tentative touch of keys. Her voice, cracked and fragile, begins to sing, "I never learned to love without destroying." Every hand I held, I crushed. Every heart that opened to me, I broke. And now I'm dying and they're all gone. But this wasn't just the rambling of a sick woman. Every line of Nina's final song referenced specific people, specific moments, specific regrets that had accumulated over her 70 years of life. And the most heartbreaking revelations were about the people closest to her, the ones she had driven away in her relentless pursuit of justice, perfection, and love. To understand Nina's final song, we need to go back to 1999, when she first received her breast cancer diagnosis. She was 66 years old, living quietly in the south of France, seemingly at peace after decades of turmoil. But the diagnosis shattered the fragile stability she had built. Cancer, Nina wrote in her journal, was God's way of giving me time to think about everything I've done wrong. And there was so much to think about. The chemotherapy made her weak, but it also stripped away the defenses she had built over a lifetime. The anger that had sustained her through racism, betrayal, and heartbreak began to dissolve, leaving behind something much more painful: clarity. Nina's relationship with her daughter Lisa had been destroyed years earlier, but as death approached, it became the source of her deepest regret. In her final song, she sings, "I gave birth to you in anger, raised you in my shadow, made you carry my pain. When you needed a mother, I gave you a warrior. When you needed love, I gave you my rage." Lisa Simone Kelly had indeed suffered under her mother's impossible expectations and violent moods. Nina had wanted her daughter to be strong, to be fierce, to never let the world break her. Instead, she had broken her herself. By 1999, Lisa barely spoke to her mother. Nina's calls went unreturned, her letters unanswered. Lisa had built a successful life as a performer, but she had done it by cutting her mother out almost entirely. As cancer weakened her body, Nina also began to question whether her decades of civil rights activism had been worth the personal cost. In her final years, she watched as racism persisted, as the gains of the 1960s seemed to erode, as new generations of Black artists achieved fame without acknowledging the battles she had fought. But the most shocking part of Nina's final song wasn't about her public battles. It was about a private shame she had never shared with anyone. A moment from her past that had haunted her for over 40 years, and that she felt she needed to confess before she died. In the middle of her final recording, Nina's voice becomes even more fragile as she sings about an incident from 1968, the worst year of her life. It was the year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, the year the civil rights movement began to fracture, the year Nina's own life started to fall apart. There was a little girl in Birmingham. She came to me after a concert, said she wanted to sing like me, said she wanted to fight like me. I looked at her sweet face and said, "Child, you don't want this life. Find something else to love. This world will break you like it broke me." Nina is referring to a real incident, one that haunted her for the rest of her life. A young Black girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, had approached her after a concert in Birmingham. The child was full of dreams, full of hope, full of the kind of innocent belief that Nina had lost long ago. Instead of encouraging the child, Nina had essentially told her to give up on her dreams. She had been so consumed by her own pain, so convinced that the fight was hopeless, that she had tried to crush a child's aspirations before the world could do it for her. Nina never knew what happened to that little girl, but she spent decades wondering if her words had changed the course of a young life. Had she prevented another voice from joining the movement? Had she killed a dream that might have changed the world? In her journal entries from 2002, Nina wrote obsessively about this encounter. I became the very thing I fought against, a voice telling a black child that she wasn't good enough, that she should know her place, that her dreams were too big for her reality. But Nina's final confession revealed something even more devastating. She had been lying to herself about why she destroyed her relationships, why she pushed people away, why she could never sustain love. The truth was more selfish and more human than anyone suspected. As her final song continues, Nina's voice becomes increasingly raw as she admits the real reason she had sabotaged every relationship in her life. I thought if I loved you less, it would hurt less when you left. I thought if I hurt you first, you couldn't hurt me worse. I thought if I became unlovable, I could blame you for not loving me, but all I did was make sure I would die as alone as I lived. This was Nina's most honest moment ever captured on tape. She wasn't pushing people away because she was strong or independent or focused on her mission. She was pushing them away because she was terrified of being abandoned. Every act of cruelty, every moment of rage, every relationship destroyed, it had all been born from fear, not strength. Nina's second husband, Andrew Stroud, had genuinely loved her when they married in 1961. He wasn't perfect, he was controlling and sometimes violent, but in her final recording, Nina acknowledges that she had also been impossible to live with. You tried to build a home with me, but I was always leaving, always running toward the next fight. You asked me to choose between you and the music, between you and the movement, between you and my anger. I chose everything but you, and then I hated you for making me choose. By 1970, Stroud couldn't take Nina's increasingly erratic behavior anymore. Their divorce was bitter and public, and Nina spent years painting him as a villain who had tried to control her career. But in her final song, she admits that she had driven him away by making their marriage a war zone. One by one, Nina's friendships had also crumbled under the weight of her impossible expectations and volatile moods. She demanded absolute loyalty while giving very little in return. She expected her friends to understand her pain while refusing to acknowledge theirs. Maya Angelou, who had been one of Nina's closest friends, eventually stopped returning her calls. James Baldwin, who had inspired much of Nina's political consciousness, grew tired of her constant anger. Even her fellow performers began to avoid her, tired of being blamed for not doing enough, not caring enough, not suffering enough. But the most devastating part of Nina's final confession was yet to come. Because as she sat dying in her bedroom, she realized that all her suffering, all her fighting, all her pain might have been for nothing. And this realization led to the most heartbreaking verse of her final song. Near the end of her recording, Nina's voice becomes barely audible as she asks the question that had tormented her final years. Did I change anything? Did my anger heal anyone? Did my pain make the world better? Or did I just spread more darkness? While calling it light, did I fight for justice? Or did I just fight? This was the existential crisis that consumed Nina's final years. She had sacrificed everything for the cause, her relationships, her peace of mind, her chance at happiness. But looking around at the world in 2003, she could see that racism still existed, that inequality persisted, that the battles she had fought were still being fought by new generations. Had it all been worth it? Had she made any real difference? Or had she just been a very talented woman who had confused her personal trauma with political activism? Nina had always seen herself as a martyr for the cause, someone who had sacrificed personal happiness for the greater good. But in her final years, she began to suspect that she had used the cause as an excuse to avoid the harder work of being human, of being vulnerable, of forgiving, of accepting love without conditions. In her journal, she wrote, "Maybe I wasn't a civil rights warrior. Maybe I was just an angry woman who found a socially acceptable way to express my rage. 3 months before her death, Nina made one last attempt to reach out to the people she had hurt. She wrote letters to Lisa, to her ex-husband, to old friends who had given up on her. The letters were found among her possessions after she died, all sealed but never sent. In the letter to Lisa, she wrote, "I know I was a terrible mother. I know I put my pain before your needs, my anger before your childhood, my cause before your heart. I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything. But I need you to know that losing you was the worst consequence of the choices I made." In the letter to Andrew Stroud, you deserved a wife who could love you without destroying herself. You deserved a partner who could be present instead of always fighting ghosts. I made you the enemy because it was easier than admitting I was broken. But Nina never sent these letters. In her final recording, she explains why. "I wrote the words I should have said, but I couldn't send them because saying sorry means admitting. I could have chosen differently. I could have loved differently. I could have been different. And that truth is harder to bear than all the pain I caused." Nina's final song reveals one last secret, something she discovered in her last weeks, that made her realize the ultimate irony of her life. It was a discovery that explained why she chose to die alone, and why her last recording was filled with such devastating regret. In the last minutes of her recording, Nina's voice becomes so weak it's almost inaudible. But her words are clear. "I found out yesterday. That little girl from Birmingham, the one I told to give up her dreams, she never gave up. She became a teacher. She taught music to children. She played my records for them. She told them about my life. She said I inspired her. Even when I tried to destroy her hope, she found inspiration in my pain. And I never knew. Nina had discovered, through a letter that reached her just weeks before her death, that the young girl from Birmingham had grown up to become a music teacher. Despite Nina's discouraging words, the child had pursued her dreams. She had spent decades teaching inner-city children, using Nina's own music as an example of how art could be a force for change. The woman had written to thank Nina for inspiring her, not knowing that Nina had spent 40 years feeling guilty about their encounter. She had no memory of Nina's discouraging words, only of meeting her hero and deciding that she wanted to make music that mattered. Nina's recording ends with what might be the most beautiful and heartbreaking verse she ever created. "So maybe I did matter. Maybe my pain had purpose. Maybe love doesn't require perfection. Maybe forgiveness doesn't require understanding. Maybe I could have been loved if I had learned to love myself. But it's too late now. Too late for everything. Except this song. This last song. This goodbye." The recording ends with Nina humming a melody that no one had ever heard before. Something beautiful and sad and completely her own. Then there's silence. Marie, Nina's housekeeper, found the tape 3 days after Nina died in her sleep. On April 21st, 2003, Marie spoke no English, so she took the tape to a local priest who had occasionally visited Nina. When he heard what it contained, he was so moved that he wept. The priest wanted to make the recording public, believing it was too important to remain hidden. But Nina's estate refused, arguing that it was too personal, too painful, too private to share with the world. Nina Simone died alone in her bedroom in Carry-le-Rouet, France. She was 70 years old. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people from around the world who had been touched by her music. But the people she had loved most and hurt most weren't there. The question that haunted her final song remains unanswered. Did her suffering serve a purpose? Did her pain make the world better? Did her art justify the cost of her relationships? Perhaps the answer doesn't matter. Perhaps Nina Simone's final song teaches us something more important than whether her sacrifices were worth it. It teaches us that even legends die with regrets, that even warriors end their battles wounded, that even voices that change the world sometimes whisper their final truths into empty rooms. Nina Simone spent her life fighting external enemies, racism, injustice, inequality. But her final recording reveals that the enemy that defeated her was internal, the inability to forgive herself, to accept love, to believe she deserved happiness. Her last song wasn't about civil rights or social justice. It was about the most universal human struggle of all, learning to live with the consequences of our choices. and finding peace in a world that offers very little of it. Nina Simone's final performance was never meant to be heard. But perhaps that's exactly why it needs to be remembered, as a reminder that behind every public figure is a private person. Behind every legend is a human being. Behind every voice that changes the world is a heart that yearns to be understood. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.